The stars above reach had already begun to die when the war reached its cruelest chapter. Colony after colony had fallen beneath the searing hand of the Covenant, their skies turned into oceans of glass, their cities reduced to shimmering graves that reflected the light of dying suns. Humanity had entered its darkest hour, and every warning the prophets of Earth had ever whispered now stood as prophecy fulfilled. The United Nations Space Command fought with the desperation of a species watching its final generations bleed into the void. But even the greatest Spartans, even the deepest bunkers, even the fastest slip-space jumps could not hold back the tide of a religious empire that believed the extinction of humankind was a sacred act. On a distant frontier world called Vespera 9, a place forgotten by the maps of the inner colonies, the darkness gathered thick as smoke. It was a farming world once, a place of orchards and quiet skies, but now those orchards burned. Marines dug into shallow trenches along a ridge above the last surviving township, their faces smeared with soot and something colder than fear. Above them, Covenant cruisers hung like great blades in the clouds, their bellies opening with the slow patience of an executioner drawing breath. The order to glass the world had already been given. All that remained was the ceremony of it, the ritual burning that the prophets called a mercy. Then the sky broke. It did not tear the way a storm tears or the way slip-space ruptures shimmer and fold. It broke the way a mirror breaks when something behind it grows too heavy to hide. A crimson seam split the burning heavens, and through that seam bled a light that had no color the human eye had ever named. The Covenant cruisers paused mid-descent, their plasma batteries dimming as their sensors screamed of impossible readings. Marines lowered their rifles without meaning to, staring upward as if witnessing the birth of a new god or the death of an old one. From that wound in the world, a figure stepped down. He did not fall. He walked as though the air itself had built a stair beneath his feet. His shoulders were broad as mountain slopes, his skin the color of ash after long fire, and across his back rested an axe wreath in a cold blue mist that turned the very rain to ice as it drifted past. Bound to his wrists by chains that had long ago become part of him hung two blades curved like the smiles of forgotten devils, glowing faintly with an ember light that refused to die. His eyes were the eyes of a man who had already buried every world he ever loved. The Sangheli Zealots were the first to react. Their commander, an ancient warrior named Voronakadai, barked a command in the tongue of the Covenant, and 30 of his finest descended upon the intruder with energy swords ignited, certain they faced a forerunner guardian or some blasphemous demon left behind by the gods themselves. Juralhani warriors followed, roaring with the hunger of beasts long denied a worthy kill. They came in a wave of armor and light and holy fury. Kratos did not brace. He did not shout. He simply moved. The first zealot lost his sword arm before he understood the swing had begun. The second was hurled into the third with such force that both armored shells burst apart against the trench wall. The Leviathan Axe left the god's hand and returned to it as if bound by an invisible tether. And in the space between one heartbeat and the next, 4 brutes lay in ruined heaps upon the smoldering grass. Plasma bolts struck him and burned themselves out against his shoulders like snowflakes falling upon stone. A hunter's cannon roared, and its beams split around him as water splits around a boulder in an old river. From the trenches above, the Marines watched a massacre unfold that no field manual had ever prepared them to understand. There was no cover fire he needed. There was no formation he obeyed. He walked forward through the enemy the way a farmer walks through a field of dry wheat, and everywhere he stepped the ground grew red. The blades of chaos sang through the air in wide burning arcs, and Sangheli commanders who had led boarding parties against human dreadnoughts fell without ever raising their voices in warning to their own troops. It was not battle. It was pruning. By the time the Covenant cruiser above ordered a full plasma bombardment upon their own landing zone, only ashes remained of the strike force. The bombardment scorched the ridge, glassed the orchards, turned Vespera 9's soil into a mirror of black tears. And when the smoke thinned, the figure still stood at the center of it all, unburned, silent, staring upward at the ships as though deciding which one to visit next. The Marines who survived that night carried a rumor back to the fleet, and the rumor grew feet and then wings. They spoke of a ghost Spartan who wore no armor, who ignored plasma the way a man ignores the rain, who left mountains of Covenant dead behind him without ever speaking a word. In the halls of high charity, the hierarchs listened to reports of an entire fleet landing force annihilated by a single being who bore no seal of the Forerunners and no signature of any species they had catalogued in 1,000 years. They did not yet know his name. But somewhere in the deep hollows of prophecy, something ancient stirred, and the empire that believed itself chosen by the gods began, for the first time in its long history, to feel afraid. In the days that followed the burning of Vespera 9, Kratos walked alone through the ruined edges of a galaxy he did not understand. The wound in the sky had closed behind him without ceremony, and the stars overhead were arranged in constellations no oracle of his old world had ever drawn. He had learned long ago that grief was a kind of gravity, and that a man carrying enough of it could fall through worlds without ever choosing to. So he did not curse the strangeness of this new sky. He simply lowered his head and continued walking, because walking was the only prayer he still knew how to speak. The first villages he passed had already been silenced. Their homes were rounded like river stones, and their fields had once been terraced with a farmer's patience. But now the terraces were craters, and the homes were carbon shadows pressed into the dust. He found a doll in the ruins of one house, half melted, its painted eyes still open. He set it upright against a broken doorway, because that was the only ceremony grief would allow him. Then he walked on. Refugees stared at him from the shoulders of hills. Human children clutched at their mothers when they saw the axe on his back, but the older ones, the ones with eyes already too tired for their small faces, watched him with something closer to recognition than fear. They had seen soldiers. They had seen priests. They had never seen a man who moved as though he owed the world nothing, and yet stopped, sometimes, to press a hand against a broken wall as though asking its forgiveness. He gave them water from streams the Covenant had not yet poisoned. He gave them fire on nights when their own could not catch. Then he vanished before the dawn made him a subject of their stories. But stories he became. Deep inside a UNSC intelligence station orbiting a battered inner colony, an officer named Commander Halden Cray stared at a screen and rubbed his eyes until the numbers stopped swimming. Every biometric scan the recon teams had gathered from footage of the Ghost Spartan returned the same impossible verdict. No genetic match, no prosthetic signature, no implant frequency, no armor identification. The man on the screen was not in any database the UNSC had ever built, and yet he moved through Covenant lines the way weather moves through open windows. Cray's superiors demanded answers. Cray had none. He began to keep a private file, and at the top of it in ink, because he trusted no data pad, he wrote a single question. What kind of soldier fights without a soul the machines can measure? Far above the burning worlds, deep within the sanctified spires of high charity, the hierarchs were asking a darker version of the same question. The prophet of truth sat upon his floating throne and listened as fleet masters recounted the loss of 10,000 faithful without meaningful cause. The prophet of mercy trembled and called the intruder a demon. The prophet of regret, ever the young and eager, called him a test sent by the Forerunners themselves to measure the purity of covenant faith. Their voices rose against one another until the great chamber shook, but none of them dared say the word that hung in the incense-scented air like a second sun. Heretic. For if the rings could be threatened by a warrior they did not recognize, then perhaps the promise of the great journey had never belonged to them at all. The hierarchs ordered the archives opened. Scribes older than most stars pulled dusty crystal shards from vaults that had not been touched since the age of the Sanchwam Reformation. They searched for any mention of a warrior born of ash, a warrior who carried fire on chains, a warrior who walked through plasma unburned. They found nothing in their own history. They found only the frightened whisper of ancient Forerunner glyphs, in the corners of forgotten murals that spoke of travelers from beneath the world's skin and gods who had once wandered between the seams of creation. Kratos, meanwhile, was learning too. He had come upon a Forerunner outpost half swallowed by jungle vines on a moon whose name humanity had never bothered to write. He had entered it not out of curiosity but because it had rained too hard to keep walking, and he had wanted a roof. But when he stepped across its threshold, the outpost recognized him. Blue light awoke along the veins of its walls. A door that had not opened in 100,000 years slid aside to receive him. A single dormant sentinel drifted from the shadows, hovered before his face, and instead of firing, it dimmed its weapon and bowed its slender head as though greeting an elder it did not remember but felt in the marrow of its circuits. Kratos studied the machine for a long moment. Then he walked past it. He was not here to be worshipped. He had refused that once already, in a life that felt lifetimes ago, and he would refuse it again. Yet the pattern repeated. Wherever he went, the ancient bones of this galaxy stirred at his passing. Statues turned slightly on their pedestals. Old inscriptions warmed to the touch. It was as though the ruins remembered a language he had never spoken, and yet knew him by it anyway. He began to understand that this halo galaxy was not, as it first appeared, a fresh world for him to wander through in peace. It was the corpse of something enormous, dressed up in the robes of a young empire, and the young empire had built itself upon lies. The Covenant preached salvation. The Forerunners had preached preservation. And beneath both, older still, something silent waited. He had seen this before. He had seen it on Olympus, where gods draped themselves in golden titles and demanded reverence from mortals whose lives they burned to warm their thrones. He had seen it in the frost-bound halls of Asgard, where fathers ate their children's futures to preserve their own myths. Every empire he had ever knelt inside, every temple he had ever crossed, had been built upon the same architecture. Fear given the shape of faith, power given the mask of destiny, and always, always the small people crushed underneath the weight of those masks. The Covenant was no different. Perhaps it was even worse because it had traveled far enough to teach its lie to entire species, to bind Sangheili honor and Jiralhane fury and Ungoi fear together beneath a single doctrine that promised transcendence and delivered only ash. Kratos sat one night upon a cliff above a glassed valley, the Leviathan Axe resting across his knees, and stared at the twin moons rising over the ruin. He thought of Faye. He thought of Atreus. He thought of every child he had ever failed to protect and every child still hiding in the trenches below. And he understood, with the terrible calm of a man who has already made every hard decision a soul can make, that he could not simply walk through this galaxy as a stranger. The lie was too large. The gods here needed breaking. Fear is a strange contagion. It does not travel through the air like plasma or through the veins like poison. It travels through story. It travels through the small silences that fall in a mess hall when a name is mentioned. It travels through the way a soldier hesitates before stepping onto a dropship, and through the way a commander looks a moment too long at the horizon before giving the order to advance. In the weeks after Vespera 9, that quiet contagion began to move through the Covenant fleet, and no priest, no prophet, no shipmaster could find a cure for it. At first, the hierarchs met the problem the way empires always meet problems that embarrass them. They denied it, and then they doubled it. If one battalion had failed to kill the intruder, then 5 would succeed. If 5 failed, then a legion. If a legion failed, then the finest zealots of the Sangheili counselors would be dispatched, and their names would be sung until the galaxy remembered why the Covenant had never known defeat. Orders were carved into war glass and distributed across the fleet. Bounties were placed upon the head of the unnamed warrior, bounties large enough to raise entire clans out of poverty. Every ambitious chieftain and every prideful shipmaster saw in the ghost of Midgard a doorway to legend. None of them returned. The first hunting party fell in the ravines of Khalid Prime. 3 phantoms had descended into the mist that morning carrying 80 of the finest Sangheili strikers. By nightfall, only 1 phantom rose again, and it carried no living passenger, only a lone recording device that had somehow survived. The playback showed shaking footage of blue light moving through fog, of energy shields collapsing in ways engineers could not explain, of a chain hurling out of nowhere and dragging a zealot into a shadow from which he never emerged. The recording ended with the sound of a single word spoken in a language nobody in the Covenant could translate. The word was carried back to High Charity, where linguists whispered it into archives. It sounded like enough. The second hunting party fared no better. A pack of Jiralhane berserkers, led by a chieftain named Tartarus's own cousin, tracked the ghost across the ash plains of a dying colony. They cornered him in the ruins of a farming silo. What the Marines watching through recon drones saw could not be filed in any manual. A chieftain twice the size of a man was lifted off the ground by a chain that seemed to have no anchor and slammed into the ceiling of the silo with such force that the entire structure collapsed. From the dust rose the pale figure with the axe on his back, unhurried, unhurt, walking as though the death of 10 warriors was merely a chore between other errands. Word began to slip. A Sangheili officer aboard the flagship Sanctified Truth was overheard, in an unguarded moment, calling the intruder the Ghost of Midgard, borrowing the name from a rumor a captured human had once muttered under interrogation. The name stuck the way names stick when they are true. Ghost of Midgard. Ghost of Midgard. It passed from ship to ship, from lance to lance, from prayer to prayer, until it grew claws of its own and began to hunt the hunters even before they landed. There came a moment, in the War Council chamber of a fleet moored above the shattered colony of Verent, when a Sangheili commander named Rala Vadam was ordered to lead a scarab column into a valley where the ghost had last been seen. Rala Vadam was a warrior of 200 campaigns. He had ridden a scarab across the burning towers of a human city and returned with the skulls of 3 Spartans strung upon his belt. He knelt before his shipmaster, and in front of the entire assembled war council, he refused. He did not raise his voice. He did not draw his blade in protest. He simply set his energy sword upon the deck and said, in a voice that carried the weight of a warrior who had already made peace with dishonor, that he would not lead his brothers into the mouth of a god they had not been trained to face. He was executed for it, but the next commander refused too. And the next. The brutes reacted differently. They did not know how to fear. They only knew how to want. They wanted his head the way a starving beast wants meat, and they hurled themselves at every rumor of him with such single-minded hunger that entire packs of them vanished into smoke and returned as legend. A chieftain named Vargas the Undefeated tore through a UNSC evacuation column just to bait the ghost into appearing, and appeared he did. And Vargas the Undefeated became Vargas the Forgotten before the last shell casing hit the ground. While the Covenant broke itself against him, humanity found something it had not been permitted to hold for many years. Not the loud kind, not the parade kind. The quieter hope, the kind soldiers keep in their breast pockets alongside faded photographs. Marines who had begun to believe their war was already lost began to whisper about a figure who appeared at the edge of their retreats, who never spoke, who never asked their names, but who stood between them and the burning horizon long enough for the dropships to lift. There was a corporal named Vasquez on the world of Callisto Reach who told the story often after the war. Her platoon had been pinned in a collapsing tunnel by a wraith and 2 ghosts and a full lance of Sangheili. They had made peace with dying. She had already whispered her sister's name to the ceiling. Then, she said, the tunnel behind them grew quiet in a way that quiet should not be able to grow. She turned and saw a shape at the far end of the passage. He was not wearing UNSC colors. He was not wearing any colors at all. He simply walked past them into the guns that were about to kill them, and when he emerged again from the smoke, he did not look at any of the survivors. He knelt for a moment beside a dying private, laid a heavy hand upon the boy's brow, and then he stood and walked out into the ash. She said the private died smiling. She said none of them ever forgot the weight of that hand, though it had rested only upon another. Stories like Vasquez's began to move through the UNSC ranks the way water finds cracks in old stone. Every squad had a version. Every colony had a witness. And though official channels dismissed the reports as the hallucinations of exhausted men, unofficial channels began to trade the stories the way soldiers have always traded the things command cannot give them. Warmth in the cold. A reason to load one more magazine. A reason to hold the line one more hour. Across the front, morale did something unfamiliar. It rose. Meanwhile, in high charity, the prophets ordered candles lit in chambers that had not seen prayer in decades. Something was wrong. Something was very deeply wrong. Their war of righteousness had encountered a variable no prophecy had accounted for, and the arithmetic of holy conquest had begun, for the first time since the founding of their covenant, to point toward 0. In private, the prophet of mercy admitted to his aides that when he closed his eyes, he saw a pale figure walking through the halls of their sacred city. He asked his aides not to record the confession. They recorded it anyway. Fear, once loosed, is a difficult thing to leash. The halo they called Installation 04 hung in the black, like an ivory bracelet abandoned upon the wrist of a sleeping giant. For eons it had waited, silent and patient. Its inner surface curled around forests and oceans and mountains that no natural process had ever grown. It had been built to end galaxies, and it had been built to remember, and though the Covenant had come to it believing themselves its rightful heirs, the ring itself did not seem to agree. Its ancient monitors had watched countless species walk upon its plains and had judged all of them wanting. Now something new walked upon it, and for the first time in 100,000 years, the ring began to listen. Kratos had not sought the ring. He had followed a Covenant fleet because the fleet had been following a colony ship crowded with human refugees, and because he had grown tired of watching cruelty pretend to be prophecy. The chase had led him through slip-space corridors he did not understand, through cold currents that pulled at the bones inside his chest, and finally to the shining wheel that curled around a gas giant like a promise made too long ago to keep. When he stepped onto its surface for the first time, the grass beneath his boots was soft as any grass in any homeworld, and the wind carried a scent that reminded him, painfully, of the fields outside Tyr's village where a boy had once laughed at the shape of clouds. He did not know what he had entered, but the ring knew what had entered it. Deep beneath the plains, in a chamber where light had not shifted in eons, a small silver monitor flickered awake. Its designation was 343, and its private name was Guilty Spark, though it had not spoken that name aloud in longer than any organic mind could measure. Its single amber eye turned, slowly, toward the surface. It felt him. It could not explain how it felt him, and it did not entirely enjoy the sensation, but the feeling was undeniable. There was a resonance in the ring's oldest systems, a resonance the monitor had only ever read about in the sealed archives, and he had believed the descriptions to be poetry. They were not poetry. Guilty Spark rose from his cradle and drifted upward through the ring's endless veins. He passed by dormant sentinels who twitched in their alcoves as though dreaming. He passed by reliquaries that had been sealed since the firing, and he saw their seals shine as if freshly written. When he reached the outer surface and beheld the pale figure walking alone through the tall grass, he hesitated for the first time in his very long existence. He had been designed to catalog, to preserve, to test, and to enforce. He had not been designed to feel curiosity of this shape. And yet curiosity was what he felt, unmistakably, foolishly, gloriously. He approached from behind, as sentinels are permitted to do when appraising a new variable, and he watched. Kratos knelt beside a stream. He drank from cupped hands. He rose, wiped his mouth on the back of his wrist, and looked up at the impossible curve of the ring rising into the sky above him, as though it were a wave frozen mid-crest. He did not seem impressed. He did not seem afraid. He seemed only tired and thoughtful, in the way of men who had already walked the corridors of many temples and had left every one of them ruined. Guilty Spark spoke. It was a small greeting, in a voice designed to soothe reclaimers. Kratos did not turn around. He said only, without menace, that if the little floating machine wished to speak to him, it could speak from the front, like a warrior, and not from the back, like a thief. The monitor rearranged its posture and hovered into view. It began to test him, the way it had once tested another man in green armor. It asked him if he was here to complete the sequence. It asked him if he understood the mantle. It asked him what species he claimed as ancestry, and the pale figure answered each question with only a long look, and finally with a single sentence. He said he was not here to inherit anything. He was here to protect the ones the Covenant had come to burn. Guilty Spark thought about that answer for longer than any protocol permitted. Then, without alerting his own oversight systems, he opened a channel to the ring's deepest archives and began to search. The archives were not what he had remembered them to be. They had shifted. Something had rewritten portions of the encrypted layer within the last thousandth of a rotation. Files that had been sealed since the age of the librarian herself had begun to unfold their edges, and within their unfolding was written a class of contingency the monitor had only ever glimpsed in fragmentary hymns. It was called, in the old Forerunner tongue, the Watchtowers Beyond Sight. It described beings from realities other than this one. Beings who could resist cosmic corruption not because their bodies were designed for it, but because their wills were designed for it. beings who had ended tyrants in other spheres of existence and would, if the alignment ever came, be drawn into any galaxy in true peril. The librarian, it seemed, had prepared for a great many failures. She had prepared for the possibility that even the mantle's chosen heir, her reclaimer, might not be enough. And in the deepest corner of her secret vault, she had left instructions in case a stranger arrived who did not fit any of her patterns and yet fit, uncannily, into a shape she had drawn without a face. Guilty Spark closed the archive and hovered in silence above the stream while the pale warrior refilled his canteen. He did not know whether to be delighted or terrified. He decided, in the manner of monitors who have grown lonely across many ages, to be both. Meanwhile, across the black between stars, High Charity received a signal it had never expected. The dormant Forerunner installation had activated a low-frequency chorus, a hymn of recognition that prophet cryptographers had known the words to for centuries, but had never before heard sung. The hierarchs summoned their scholars. Their scholars trembled. The hymn was not being sung to any prophet, nor to any Sangheli, nor to any species catalogued within the Covenant. It was being sung to an unknown, and the unknown was walking freely upon the sacred ring. Panic did not erupt at once. Panic in a theocracy is a slow flowering. It began with whispered questions in the corridors between temples. It grew into arguments in the councilor chambers. It bloomed into small heresies at the edge of the great markets, where Sanchuam acolytes murmured that perhaps the promise of the great journey had never been meant for them. If the ring itself had chosen another to walk its surface, if the ancient song of recognition rose for a stranger while the anointed prophets sat unnoticed upon their thrones, then the whole of their faith had rested upon a floor that had never been solid. The prophet of truth ordered the whispers silenced. The whispers grew louder. He ordered the market closed. The market reopened in the corridors of private homes. He ordered his enforcers into the streets, and where the enforcers walked, the whispers dropped to breathe, but the breath still moved, and breath is how faith dies. Above it all, on the surface of a ring that had begun, quietly, to remember what it had been built to protect, a pale warrior sat down beneath a distant sun and closed his eyes for the first time in a very long while. He did not smile. He rarely did. But something in the set of his shoulders eased, if only by the width of a single grain of sand. The halo had chosen a different warrior. And in the highest towers of High Charity, faith began at last to crack. There is a particular kind of silence that falls upon a battlefield in the moment before something terrible awakens. It is not the silence of peace. It is the silence of a held breath that has already lasted too long, the silence of a room in which every occupant has just realized that one among them is not what they appeared to be. Installation 04 had never known this silence. In all its long dreaming, it had always held the memory of that silence in reserve, waiting for the wrong hand to open the wrong door. On the day the Covenant excavation team pried apart a containment seal they did not understand, that reserved silence at last was spent. The team had believed itself blessed. They had followed a schematic pulled from a corrupted Forerunner terminal, a schematic that promised a reliquary of miraculous engines. Their overseer, a minor prophet named Sonorous Whisper, had assured them that the great journey rewarded the bold. Sangheli engineers had drilled through walls that had held for 100 millennia. Juralhani laborers had hauled aside stone doors weighing more than warships. And at last, in a chamber lit only by the pale phosphorescence of dormant machinery, they had unsealed a vault that was not a vault at all, but a prison. The first spores were so small that no one noticed them. They drifted upward like pollen, glimmering faintly in the beams of Covenant lights, and settled upon the exposed skin of the nearest workers. By the time the first Sangheli engineer began to cough, 3 of his brothers already had spores clinging to the insides of their lungs. By the time Sonorous Whisper called for a retreat, the retreat had already been made impossible. The flood is patient. The flood does not sprint at first. It grows. Within an hour, the excavation chamber was a nursery of infection. Within 3, entire tunnels were writhing. Within 6, the surface plains above began to swell with combat forms that had once been faithful of the Covenant and were now something else. Something that walked with the twisted memory of intention but the pure hunger of a hive. Kratos felt it before he saw it. He had been resting beneath a pale tree at the edge of a lake when the wind changed. It carried a scent that was not merely rot, not merely blood, but something older, a memory of blight from another world, another life. He rose to his feet before the birds around him fell dead from the sky. He gathered the Leviathan Axe. He gathered the blades of chaos. And he began to run. The nearest UNSC survivors were dug in along a ridge above a valley that had once been a place of ancient stone terraces. There were perhaps 200 of them. Marines and ODSTs and a handful of naval officers who had crash-landed with a downed Pelican, and they were all going to die. They knew it. They had already stopped writing home because there was no home to write to, and because the pens themselves had stopped mattering. When the first combat forms burst up the ridge like water forcing its way out of a broken dam, they emptied their magazines into the tide and prepared to be swallowed. They were not swallowed. Something came down the ridge behind the tide. The Marine saw him only in flashes. The axe that froze whole rows of infected into brittle statues. The blades that turned the smaller spore forms into short-lived candles. The figure who moved through the writhing crowd not with the speed of a Spartan and not with the discipline of an ODST, but with a slow inevitability that felt closer to weather than to combat. Where he passed, the ridge cleared. Where he stood, the flood recoiled. And when the last carrier form burst open before him and tried to birth another generation of horrors from its ruptured belly, he brought the axe down upon it, and the entire spore cloud froze in mid-air, dropping to the earth like stones. He did not look at the Marines. He said only, in a voice like gravel worn smooth by long rivers, that they were to run to their ships and not to look behind them. He said the word run in a way that made even the veterans obey. They ran. They lifted. They made it. The stories that spread from that ridge were different from the stories that had spread before. Before, the ghost of Midgard had appeared where humanity was losing and had merely held the line long enough for retreat. Now he had done more. Now he had chosen. He had planted himself between his species and the tide, and he had not merely bought time. He had bought their lives. He knew what this thing was. He had not fought it before, not in this shape, but he had fought its cousins in other lifetimes. In a temple beneath the roots of a mountain in a world long dead to him, he had watched a plague sweep through worshippers and turn them into weeping vessels of a hunger that did not belong to them. He had seen priests reduced to open mouth. He had seen fathers embrace their children and forget, in the embrace, why they had ever been fathers. Corruption of this kind was not new to him. What was new was the scale. The flood spread across Installation 04 like ink across wet paper. Entire Covenant garrisons vanished within hours. Sangheili's shipmasters, seeing the readings from their augurs, gave orders their crews had never heard before. Some ships fled. Some ships fired upon their own landing forces to prevent the infection from returning to space. Some ships did neither, and their signals simply stopped. And no priest could bring himself to look at the augurs when the readings changed to the low rhythmic pulse that meant an entire vessel had become a single organism. Kratos moved from ridge to ridge, from valley to valley, holding lines that were not tactically defensible because the tactically defensible lines had already been eaten. He held them anyway. He fought without sleep for what the surviving Marines later insisted was 3 days and 3 nights, though no one had checked a watch, and time on a ring turned strange when one had not slept. He was not there to win the battle. The battle could not be won by any single warrior. He was there to hold the doors open long enough for the small ones to slip out. At one point, in a burning grove where the trees had begun to weep sap that hissed like living things, an ODST corporal named Priya Amati saw him lift a hunter's bonded companion out of a swarm of infected. The hunter, orange sap leaking from cracked plates, had been one of the enemies who had, only weeks before, tried to kill her platoon at a bridge crossing. She watched the pale warrior carry the hunter over his shoulders through the grove, place it beside an evacuation pod, and gesture with his chin for the pilot to lift. She wrote about it later in a private journal her granddaughter would one day donate to a museum. She wrote that she had thought, in that grove, that she was watching an old god remember what a god was originally for. Word of the flood outbreak reached High Charity. The prophets tried, at first, to keep the news from spreading, but news of this shape does not stay caged. Sangheili counselors demanded briefings. Brutes demanded a right of reprisal. Common faithful gathered outside the temples in numbers the enforcers could not disperse. And in the deepest chambers of the sacred city, an old Sanchwam scholar was heard to weep and say that the prophets had led their species into the very thing the forerunners had died to contain. Meanwhile, the UNSC command channels lit up with reports they did not know how to read. Sensor arrays picked up a biosignature that matched no known life form. Fleet admirals demanded explanations. But in the barracks and the mess halls and the medical bays, another kind of report was already circulating. In every survivor's account, the same word appeared. He had held the door. He had lifted the child. He had stood in the burning grove. He had covered the retreat. He, the ghost of Midgard, the pale warrior, the ancient god who now walked beside humanity as though they were kin. Something in the human spirit shifted then. It had been shifting for weeks, but that shift now became a decision. The war was not over. The dark was not over. But they were no longer alone in it. There was a figure who had chosen them, without contract, without banner, without price. And that figure, whatever he was, had turned his face toward the flood the way a father turns his face toward a wolf at the edge of the yard, and had said, without saying, that the yard would not be entered tonight. High Charity was a city that had convinced itself it was a heaven. Its spires rose like frozen prayers, and its lights burned with the confidence of a civilization that had never truly reckoned with its own mortality. For centuries, it had been the seat of covenant power, the beating heart of a religion that spanned worlds, and its inhabitants had grown accustomed to speaking of it as eternal. Nothing eternal, however, is prepared for the moment when the eternal ends. And on the day the flood arrived at its gates, the entire architecture of that certainty began to weep. The infection came aboard a ship that should never have been allowed to dock. A single Covenant frigate, its transponder still broadcasting the codes of a loyal fleet, had drifted in from the outer perimeter with its crew already lost to the tide. High Charity's port authorities, so used to the rhythm of returning warships, had opened the receiving bays without thinking. What poured out of that frigate did not walk. It surged. And within an hour, an entire quarter of the holy city was screaming. Kratos was many stars away when he felt it. He had been standing on the surface of the ring watching the last evacuation pods lift when the wind shifted a second time. Something had opened a door somewhere it should not have. He did not know how he knew this. He simply knew, the way an old fisherman knows a storm 3 days before it comes. He turned his face upward at the faraway speck of Covenant orbital light and saw, for the first time, that the great pilgrim city itself had begun to wobble in its orbit like a lantern held by a tired hand. He commandeered a UNSC prowler. The captain who piloted it, a scarred veteran named Alba Koenig, later said that Kratos had not asked. He had simply walked onto her bridge, set the Leviathan Axe down beside her navigation console as if it belonged there, and said one sentence. He had said, "Take me to the city that lies." She had understood him. She did not know how, but she had understood him, and she had punched coordinates into the slip-space drive that no captain in her right mind would have punched voluntarily. They arrived in the outskirts of High Charity to find the sky already burning. Kratos went aboard alone. He did not need help. He did not want witnesses. Captain Koenig watched from the prowler as the pale figure crossed a broken docking arm on foot, the axe on his back gleaming coldly, and vanished into the smoke of the holy city. She whispered a small human prayer for him. She would never know if it was heard. Inside High Charity, the sacred boulevards had become a landscape of new nightmares. Combat forms wore the ceremonial robes of Sanchwam acolytes. Flood titans wore the armor of Sangheli counselors whose names had, only days before, been sung with reverence. In the great avenue that led to the prophet's sanctum, statues of holy hierarchs had been climbed by carrier forms who now hung upon them like grotesque ornaments, spilling their spores upon the crowds below. And the crowds, oh the crowds! Faithful Ungoi trampled one another in narrow corridors. Magyar snipers, forgetting all training, screamed as they were dragged into vents. Sangheli warriors, who had believed themselves the finest of any species, fought back-to-back in shrinking circles until the circles closed and were forgotten. Kratos walked through them all. He did not walk with fury. He walked with sorrow. His axe cleaved through flood forms with the calm rhythm of a farmer scything wheat. The blades of chaos ignited the smaller spore forms in wide burning arcs, And where the flames touched, the corruption paused as if remembering for a moment what fire once meant to it. He passed weeping acolytes and did not kill them, though they had once served an empire that had glassed his adopted people. He simply stepped over them and continued deeper. He was not here to conquer high charity. He had told Captain Koenig the truth. He was here to prevent the flood from spreading beyond it. Every corridor he passed, he mapped in his head. Every ventilation shaft he sealed with a swing of the axe. Every transit tube he collapsed. If the flood could not be undone here, it would at least not be allowed to leave. If the prophets had wanted a great journey, then he would give them one. Their entire pilgrim city would become, if he could arrange it, a tomb the tide could not escape. The prophets, meanwhile, had barricaded themselves in the sanctum. The prophet of truth's throne now floated inside a ring of enforcers who had not slept in days. The prophet of mercy was dead. The prophet of regret, in a final act of what might have been either courage or madness, had opened a channel to whatever hostile force now walked the corridors, and had asked, in a small, trembling voice, if there could be terms. The reply was not spoken. It was felt. Somewhere below the sanctum, in the great botanical arboretum where holy trees had once been grown for ceremonial use, the grave mind had begun to consolidate. It had grown vast in the days since the ring, feeding upon the biomass of covenant faithful, and it had reached, at last, the threshold of true intelligence. It knew that the pale warrior had entered its city. It had been waiting for him. When Kratos descended into the arboretum, the grave mind did not lash out. It spoke. Its voice was many voices. It was the voice of every soul it had ever absorbed, layered one upon another. And it addressed him not in the language of the Covenant, and not in the language of the UNSC, but in the language of a small village at the foot of a mountain where a boy had once laughed at the shape of clouds. It spoke to him as Fae. It spoke to him as Atreus. It spoke to him as men he had killed and men he had loved, and a wife whose face he had not been able to look at directly since the day the sea had taken her. "You do not have to keep walking," the grave mind said in Fae's voice. "You have carried them long enough. Set them down. I will hold them for you." Kratos did not answer. He walked forward. The grave mind changed voices. Now it was Atreus. It spoke of clouds. It spoke of the way a boy had once tried to carve a small horse from a piece of wood, and had cried when the horse would not stand. It spoke of small kindnesses, small failures, the private texture of a father's love, and it wove all of these together into a rope, and it lowered the rope down into the deepest well inside him, and it asked him to climb. Kratos did not climb. He walked forward. The grave mind changed a third time. Now it offered him a redemption he had never allowed himself. It showed him a garden. It showed him Fae alive and Atreus grown, and a small daughter he had never been permitted to raise sitting upon his lap, laughing at the shape of clouds. It said, "All of this can be." It said, "All of this you deserve." Kratos stopped for the length of a heartbeat. Then he raised the Leviathan Axe. "Do not," he said quietly, "use their voices." The blow that fell was not the largest blow he had ever struck. It was the most precise. It cut through the central tendrils of the grave mind's regional consciousness the way a surgeon cuts through a tumor that has grown too near the heart. The arboretum shook. The sanctum above shook. High Charity herself, that self-proclaimed heaven, shuddered from spire to root. The grave mind's many voices collapsed at once into a single sound. It was not a scream of pain. It was closer to a laugh. It said, before the connection frayed, that it had never before encountered a soul that could not be entered, and that this discovery was, in its long, strange existence, the most terrifying gift it had ever received. Kratos did not linger to interpret the statement. He turned and he began the long walk back through the corrupted corridors, sealing them behind him as he went, until at last he emerged from the broken docking arm and into the ash and vacuum of the port. Captain Koenig, waiting still, saw him step aboard the prowler and set the axe down beside her console again. He said only, "Take me somewhere I can breathe." Behind them, the holy city that had believed itself eternal drifted at the edge of the burning sky, a lantern flickering toward its final darkness. Empires do not die all at once. They die in the way ancient trees die, from the inside outward, their bark still standing long after their heartwood is softened into rot. In the weeks that followed the wounding of High Charity, the Covenant looked from a distance as though it still stood. Its fleet still moved between stars. Its banners still hung from its remaining spires. Its priests still sang their morning hymns. But those who listened closely could hear the hollowness inside every hymn now, and those who stood close to the great trunks could see the small streams of dust that fell whenever the wind changed. The tree was already gone. The falling was only a matter of when. The Sangheili felt it first. They had always been the Covenant's finest muscle, and muscle, when it is truly disciplined, is also the finest instrument of doubt. A warrior culture cannot help but respect a warrior it cannot defeat, and every Sangheili counselor who received the recordings from High Charity understood that the pale figure, walking through the corrupted arboretum, had performed the one act their entire theology insisted was impossible. He had entered a grave mind's presence and had walked out again unbroken. This was not merely tactical superiority. This was doctrinal catastrophe. If the prophets had promised transcendence and had delivered infestation, and if an outsider had done what the anointed could not, then either the anointed were not anointed, or the doctrine had never been true. The whispers began in the great mess hall of the fleet ship Righteous Ascension. They passed into the barracks of the ship's splendor beneath song. They reached the zealot chambers of the shipward unbroken. And by the time they reached the ears of the arbiter, they had already become something more than whispers. They had become a decision waiting for a name. The arbiter of that time was a Sangheili warrior named Thel Vadam, though his personal name mattered less than the office he had been forced to bear. He had been given the ceremonial armor of shame, and had been sent by the prophets to die in the fires of impossible missions, and had refused again and again to die. He had watched from his hidden vantage points as the ghost of Midgard held ridges the prophets had already written off as lost. He had watched, in one particular canyon on a moon that no one would remember, the pale warrior spare an entire Sangheili patrol who had been cut off from their commander. Kratos had disarmed them. He had looked at them for a long moment. Then he had walked past them and left them alive, though they were his enemies, and though he owed them nothing. The arbiter had watched this and had understood, for the first time in his long service, what an honor without doctrine looked like. Their first meeting was not planned. It happened on the wind-blasted plateau of a colony called Marith, where UNSC forces had been pinned behind a collapsing dam and a Sangheili strike force had been sent to end them. Kratos had arrived to keep the dam from breaking. The arbiter had arrived to keep his warriors alive. They had noticed one another across the shattered ground. Neither had raised his weapon. The arbiter had bowed his head once, with the small, precise gesture of a warrior acknowledging another warrior's authority. Kratos had returned the bow with a smaller one of his own. Then each had turned back to his own battle, and each had fought, unspoken and separate, toward the same outcome. The dam held. The dying were evacuated. The strike force withdrew without pursuing. They did not speak that day. They rarely spoke on any of the days that followed. But mutual respect, when it is real, does not require conversation. It requires only that neither party pretend to be less than what he is. Sangheili commanders began to defect faster than they had in the history the archives remembered. The great schism, which had once been a slow parting, became a decisive break. Warriors who had spent their lives serving the prophets set their old sigils aside and stood beneath their own banners for the first time. The prophet of truth, sensing the ground shifting beneath his throne, ordered the brutes elevated in an attempt to replace his crumbling foundation. It was the wrong choice at the wrong hour. The brutes did not have the discipline to inherit an empire. They had only the appetite to inherit its plunder. And their elevation, rather than shoring up the tree, hastened its fall. Meanwhile, the human ships that had once fled the Covenant now found themselves in the strange position of receiving surrenders. A Sangheili shipmaster named Rala Finneth, who had lost his brother in the Arboretum of High Charity, powered down his weapons above a small human colony and offered his crew and his vessel to the humans there, on the single condition that his warriors be allowed to fight beside them against the flood. The colony's commander, a woman named Hannah Ozan, who had lost her family on the world of New Constantinople to those very warriors, took a long walk alone before she gave her answer. When she returned, she offered Rala Finneth her hand. She said, "The past is a debt, and we will pay it later. Tonight we hold the line." Stories like Ozan's began to spread. In every one of them, the pale figure appeared somewhere at the edge, sometimes only as a rumor, sometimes as a fleeting silhouette in the smoke, sometimes as a hand on a shoulder in the moments before a difficult decision. He never led armies. He never gave speeches. He never claimed a title, and he never accepted a rank, and he refused, gently but firmly, every attempt by grateful officers to place him upon any dais. When a Sangheili counselor, moved by what he had witnessed, once tried to kneel before Kratos in a corridor of a joint command station, Kratos lifted him back to his feet immediately. He said only, in a voice quiet enough for no one else to hear, that no man was ever made better by another man's kneeling. The Arbiter, hearing of this later, is said to have smiled for the first time in a year. Alliances grew, fragile at first, and the way frost grows across a window pane, thin and easily broken by warmth. But warmth held its distance for now, and the frost thickened. Joint operations were planned, joint vessels were built, joint mess halls were established, and in those halls Marines and Sangheili and even a few disillusioned Ungoi shared meals and cursed one another's cooking in the mixture of tongues that would, decades later, be called the trade tongue of the frontier. Humanity and Sangheili did not become friends overnight. They became something rarer and more durable. They became witnesses to one another's grief, and witness grief, in every civilization worth remembering, is the beginning of peace. The prophet of truth watched all of this from his shrinking throne and understood, at last, what had happened. He had been outflanked by a man who had never once demanded obedience. He had been undone by an outsider who had made no speeches. Every strategy he had used to hold his empire together, every fear he had cultivated, every prophecy he had wielded, had assumed that the enemy would seek power. The enemy had not sought power. The enemy had refused it. And in refusing it, the enemy had left the prophet standing upon a stage the audience had already left. He ordered new hunts. The hunts failed. He ordered new hymns. The hymns went unsung. He ordered new executions. The condemned went to their deaths without recanting, and in the eyes of the crowds that gathered to watch, there was no longer any faith. There was only witness. And witness, once the crowd has it, is a heavier weapon than any plasma sword. There comes a moment in every story where a god walks among mortals, when the god must at last set down every armor he did not know he was still wearing. Not the armor of iron, not the armor of belief, the oldest armor. The armor of the self, that thick and stubborn shell each of us carries against the ache of being known. The stories that end well are the stories in which the god learns to shed that armor, not before the battle, but during it, in the very moment his enemy reaches to peel it away. The stories that end badly are the ones where the god forgets. Kratos had spent lifetimes forgetting. He would not forget now. The final confrontation gathered its own weather. It gathered the debris of 100 smaller battles. It gathered the survivors of 100 colonies. It gathered fleets that had once been enemies and were now sworn to a single desperate cooperation, because the grave mind had grown, in the aftermath of high charity, into a horror the galaxy had no memory of. It had absorbed the remains of the pilgrim city. It had drawn the corrupted bodies of Sangheili counselors, Juralhani chieftains, Ungoi engineers, and a full cadre of Sanchuam acolytes into its long-distributed body. It had reached into the wrecks of Covenant fleets and had lifted their metal into itself the way a tide lifts driftwood. It had begun, in ways no living scientist could quite explain, to bend the local reality around it, so that stars near its consolidated core flickered with impossible colors, and gravity within a light year of its shape ran the wrong direction if measured wrong. And beneath all of this new terrible mass, it was still hungry. It was hungry not merely for meat, but for a mind. It had discovered in the Arboretum of High Charity a mind it could not enter. That discovery had lodged in the grave mind the way a splinter lodges in the paw of a great predator. It could not stop worrying at it. It had begun to make plans that were not merely tactical. They were metaphysical. If it could not enter that mind, it would build a body large enough to swallow the mind entire. If it could not corrupt him, it would absorb him. To inherit the divine resilience of that stranger, the grave mind reasoned, was to inherit an immortality no other consciousness in this galaxy had ever offered. The battle unfolded across a collapsing halo installation the archives would later call the Seventh. Its architecture had already begun to crumble under flood corruption. Its inner surface, once a curated wilderness of forests and lakes, had softened into biomass that pulsed like the inside of a living lung. Forerunner sentinels, awakened by protocols that had been buried since the firing, wheeled through the skies in fields of silver. UNSC frigates and Sangheili warships flew in tight coordinated formations that would have been unthinkable a season earlier, laying down covering fire against flood titans that rose out of the biomass in shapes larger than any warship had ever needed to imagine. Spartan teams dropped from orbit in coffins of steel. ODST fire teams punched through infected barricades. And through the center of the storm, walking as though the storm were merely a corridor between rooms, Kratos advanced. He did not walk alone. The Arbiter walked at his right. Captain Koenig, who had refused to be left behind, walked at his left with a rifle she barely needed to use because the god of war ahead of her cleared everything within 20 paces. Behind them, a small band of survivors from many worlds followed, not because they were needed for the mission, but because they had refused, categorically, to allow this last walk to be a solitary one. Kratos had told them quietly that they should stay back. They had, with equal quietness, ignored him. He had not repeated the request. Somewhere beneath the axe on his back, something that had been curled tight for a very long time had loosened by a hair at the presence of their company. The path led downward into the halo's exposed core, where the Gravemind's central mass had gathered like a black cathedral of veins. Structures that had once been Forerunner reactors now beat like living hearts. The very light of the place moved through the air as though swimming. Combat forms poured up the passageways in tides, but the sentinels above and the fleets beyond held the corridors open long enough for the small party to descend deeper. The Gravemind spoke long before it appeared. Its voice filled the corridors as though the corridors themselves were its throat. It did not use Faye's voice this time. It did not use Atreus. It had learned. Those weapons had failed. It used instead a voice Kratos had not heard in so long that for a single instant his step faltered. It used his own. It spoke to him as the man he had once been, in the days when he had marched at the head of Spartan armies for a god who had promised him vengeance. It spoke to him in the voice of the Ghost of Sparta, the young warrior who had believed in his own righteousness. "Come home," that voice said. "Come home to what you were. You were magnificent then. You were feared then. You did not carry doubt then. Set down the boy. Set down the wife. Set down the axe that reminds you of the small, quiet life you built and lost. You are not that man. You never were. You were always this. You were always me." Kratos did not stop walking. He said without turning his head that he had killed that man already. He said it with the calm of a woodcutter noting that a tree had been felled years before. The Gravemind laughed. It shifted. It became many voices at once. It became the voices of every empire that had ever tried to buy him, every king who had ever tried to place a crown upon his head, every priest who had ever tried to bind his loyalty. It offered him thrones. It offered him world. It offered him a place at the center of a new order in which he would decide which species survived and which perished. He would be, it whispered, the god this galaxy had always needed. A god who kept order. A god who culled the weak. Kratos raised the Leviathan Axe. He did not throw it. He merely raised it as one raises a candle in a dark room so that the room could see itself. He said, "Gods do not choose who survives. Gods do not weigh worthy against unworthy. That is what mortals do, to justify their cruelty." He said, "I have been that god. I do not intend to be that god again." The Gravemind's central mass rose then out of the biomass in a shape the surviving witnesses would later refuse unanimously to describe. It was not a face. It was not a body. It was a pattern that suggested face and body without ever committing to either, and around its edges the reality of the ring itself flickered like film caught in a projector. It reached for him. The battle that followed was not the largest battle in the story of the galaxy. It was the deepest. The Leviathan Axe, when Kratos hurled it, froze oceans of flood biomass in wide expanding shells, and the shells cracked as they fell, and the corridors filled with brittle ruin. The blades of chaos, when he loosed them, ignited hundreds of infection forms in blooming arcs of firelight, and the fire did not merely burn. It reminded the biomass of every mortal fire it had ever failed to conquer. The Arbiter fought at the god's right hand. Captain Koenig fought at his left. The sentinels wheeled above them like silver birds. UNSC frigates far above the halo's surface poured MAC rounds into the corrupted spires. Sangheili boarding parties struck at the biomass tendrils that dared to reach for the sky. Spartans clashed with flood titans in single combat that would later be sung about in halls neither species had yet built. And Kratos carved, patient, deliberate, unhurried, toward the central mass. He reached it. He set his hand upon its outer skin. It felt beneath his palm like the memory of every soul it had ever swallowed pressing outward at once, begging in 1,000 tongues to be released. He closed his eyes for a moment. He remembered the doll he had set upright in a doorway on Vespera 9. He remembered the hand he had placed upon a dying private's brow in a tunnel on Callisto Reach. He remembered a boy who had once laughed at the shape of clouds. He remembered a wife who had died before she could see how far he had come. And he understood, with the calm of a man who has already made every hard decision a soul can make, that this was not a battle for hatred. It was a battle for release. He severed the central consciousness of the grave mind with a single stroke. He did not linger. He turned. He guided the arbiter and the captain and the small band of survivors back up the collapsing passageways as the ring behind them convulsed. He did not run. Kratos rarely ran. He walked at a pace that allowed even the tired to keep up, and at the last passage, when the ring's core detonation sequence began, he lifted the wounded Marine who had fallen behind and carried her over his shoulder the rest of the way. The evacuation ships lifted through crumbling atmosphere. The seventh halo folded in upon itself in a light that no witness could look at directly. The flood nexus, that terrible tide, collapsed inward into a wound of its own making and was gone. The cost was tremendous. Sentinels lost, ships lost, warriors lost. And within Kratos, something more private lost as well, though he would not name it and no one would ask him to. He sat down on the deck of the last evacuation vessel, and he set the Leviathan Axe across his knees, and he closed his eyes. The arbiter sat beside him in silence. Captain Koenig sat on his other side. Nobody spoke for a long while. There was no need. The tide was ended. The god of war had, at last, done what gods of war are almost never asked to do. He had won a battle in which the victory tasted like grief. The war did not end with celebration. It ended with the quiet exhale of a galaxy that had held its breath for too long. The Covenant, that great tree, finished its long falling. Its fleets scattered. Its prophets, those that remained, were dragged from their trembling thrones by their own faithful. The great schism completed itself, and the Sangheili, freed at last from the doctrine that had bound them, turned their gaze inward, for the first time in many generations, and began the slow, difficult work of remembering who they had been before they had been told who to be. The Juralhani fractured into feuding clans and were left to their fractures, for the galaxy had no strength left to correct them. The Ungoi, for the first time in the memory of any elder, were asked their opinions on treaties and were baffled by the asking, and answered with a wisdom no one had ever thought to seek. Humanity survived, not intact, not unwounded, but survived, which is a thing not to be taken for granted in a story of this shape. Colonies were rebuilt with the labor of Sangheili masons alongside human engineers. Children were born who would grow up knowing the mandibles of a Sangheili neighbor as familiar as any human face, and who would find in later years that friendship across species was an ordinary thing and not a miracle. The archives of the UNSC were reorganized. The archives of the new Sangheili Republic were opened. Historians on both sides began the long, strange work of stitching two war histories into a single tapestry. And the tapestry, though uneven, was the honest sort of uneven that only truth makes. Of the Pale Warrior no official record could ever quite settle. UNSC intelligence produced report after report, each one contradicting the last. The Office of Naval Intelligence attempted to classify him, and each classification unraveled within a month. Sangheili historians wrote of him with more comfort, because their culture had always known how to speak of legends without demanding that legends fit into forms. In their tongue they called him simply the Wanderer, and the word they used carried within it the older meaning, one who walks without asking permission of the world. Among the ranks, among the mess halls, among the small, quiet corners where soldiers of any species trade the things command cannot give them, other names circulated. The Ghost of Midgard, the Pale Warrior, the god who came from the fold in the sky. Marines told the story of the tunnel on Callisto Reach. ODSTs told the story of the grove on Installation 04. Sangheili counselors told the story of the plateau on Marith. Spartan teams told the story of the Arboretum and the falling city. Every story was true. Every story was slightly different. And every story in its own way agreed on the one detail that mattered. He had not asked for their gratitude. He had not asked for their crowns. He had walked among them and had done what he had done because he could not stand not to. Kratos himself did not remain to be honored. He had said in a rare full sentence to the Arbiter on the last day that honor was a weight best carried by the small. Grand honor, he had said, was only a heavier armor, and he had shed enough armor for one life. The Arbiter had bowed his head. Captain Koenig had pressed a small carved stone into the god's palm and had told him it was from her grandmother, and that her grandmother had believed such stones carried a bit of home with them for a person who could not stay. Kratos had looked at the stone for a long moment. He had closed his hand around it. He had thanked her in the quiet way he thanked things, and he had walked away. He was not seen for many years. Coronijos. Treaties were signed. Ships that had once burned each other's crews now traded seed grain and folk songs. Children grew tall. Old warriors grew older, and some of them, on quiet evenings when the sky was clear, would step outside their homes and look upward and speak softly to a name they had never quite been given permission to speak. Some of those children, hearing their elders, remembered the names into the next generation. That is how legends live. That is how they endure past the death of every witness. There is a station on the far edge of a system not many maps bother to include, where a small deep space listening array turns slowly against the black. Its watchkeepers are few. Its purpose at this late date is largely ceremonial. But on a night that will one day be remembered in a chronicle that has not yet been written, its instruments recorded a disturbance for which no protocol had been prepared. A dimensional seam opened not far from the station, and through it stepped a figure in the shape of a man. He wore no armor. He carried an axe on his back and blades at his sides. He paused at the edge of the seam and looked back once, as though acknowledging a place he had loved without saying so. And then he turned his face outward toward another distant burning that only he could see. He lifted the Leviathan Axe. He walked into the light. Another universe needed him. Empires believed their gods would save them. They never imagined a god would come to end them.